Jonathan Balcombe is an ethologist and author, formerly Director of Animal Sentience with the Humane Society Institute for Science and Policy. He was department chair for animal studies with the Humane Society University in Washington, D.C., and served as associate editor of the journal Animal Sentience. And until recently, Jonathan was lecturing internationally on animal behavior and the human-animal relationship. Jonathan has worked for several animal protection organizations, including the Humane Society of the United States, the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Jonathan has published scholarly articles, book chapters, and popular science books on various topics, including animal behavior, animal research, animal dissection, medical simulation, and veganism. His most recent book is the New York Times bestseller, What a Fish Knows, combining science and storytelling to examine the inner lives of the world's most diverse group of vertebrates. And his next book, SuperFly, is scheduled for release later this year. Thank you so much for being here today, Jonathan. So
Thanks,
you're
Janine. Nice to be here.
absolutely you're currently in Southern Ontario doing research for your new book, which I'm really excited about. And you're also studying the squirrels in your backyard. I guess there's lots of time now to study things like squirrels and insects.
Well, nature's wonderful because it's always available. Even in an urban setting, there's wildlife if you look closely, most likely birds and or insects in that setting. But I live in the east end of a small town of 50,000, and there's a bay shore here. Lake Ontario is literally a quarter of a mile from my front door. Nice trails along there, so lots to see, lots to go and investigate. I go out every weekend to a local provincial park or some other nature area. And now that it's spring, May is the most exciting month of the year for nature lovers and especially birders because the migrants are coming through and there's just so much going on. The air is filled with the sounds of birds, which is heartwarming to one who's concerned about the loss of wildlife that we've been experiencing worldwide.
I've heard that insects and bugs are having are something we maybe aren't noticing that they're diminishing at kind of a rapid rate. We might notice because we monitor other animals, but where was I hearing this about when you were a kid and you were driving and you would have to always clean your windshield after a drive on the highway because it was all splattered with bugs, and now that doesn't happen anymore. Is that real? Is there definitely a decline?
Very well documented, certainly in some studies, and particularly in Europe, where the scientists have been doing some interesting surveys. They actually use windshield splatometers essentially to as one measure. It's sad and telling that one way of measuring the decline of insects is how many get smashed against windshields. There's a lesson in there, I think, somewhere. But the main causes of insect decline are thought to be the use of pesticides and habitat loss. These are scourges for all walks of life, not just insects, but insects making up 80% of all known species on Earth. They're incredibly diverse and successful, as that figure indicates. If we study them, we notice, and there have been surveys being done 50 years ago, and then the scientists go out and resurvey 45, 50 years later using preferably the same techniques, and they can literally measure the change. You can just measure that we've had declines of well over 50% in numbers in some locations. Of
Hmm.
course, you have to be careful about time of year, big weather events, El Nino events, and other things like that that can year to year affect numbers. But scientists have good ways of accounting for those things by larger sample size, sampling at different times. And it's quite clear the writing's on the wall. To the extent that insects are bellwethers of other species and general ecological declines, we are in trouble. Hear more and more, fortunately, the discussion about an approaching sixth extinction, and this one being the first one caused by the presence of one species, ours. So yeah, the insects definitely are in trouble.
So I can hear people saying, oh, that's great. That means less mosquitoes biting me. That means less bugs. I have to worry about flies in the house and that sort of thing. But why should we care about bugs? Why are bugs important to us as a species?
Sure, great question. I mean, if we lost all the insects or even most of them, we wouldn't be having the conversation because humans would be long gone. We live on a planet that is absolutely dependent on interrelationships and interactions by other species. Insects, because of their numerosity and their presence, their huge diversity, they're absolutely vital cogs in the chain of ecology. And if they went, animals that feed on them, plants that are pollinated by them, there's a lot of hand wringing about the loss of honeybees, and that's just symptomatic of the vital role that insects play. One of the key points I try to make in my upcoming book, SuperFly, is that flies are ranked right behind bees and wasps for their importance as pollinators. Most people don't know that, but if we lost them, we'd lose a great diversity of part of what makes plants grow. And plants are ultimately our food. There's those of us who eat plants directly and only plants, but even those who eat meat, who eat animals, what do those animals feed on? They're fed on plants. So, and every ecosystem is intertwined with every other ecosystem. So, we just can't afford to keep running roughshod over the planet. We have to look in the mirror and realize we have to take some steps. And of course, many people are talking about that in a growing number. But we have to act on this. Some serious things we need to do.
Yeah, humans are often kind of selfish in that as long as there's a purpose that serves us, then we'll work to protect and care about these species. But as we grow as vegans, certainly as I've evolved as a vegan, I have more and more concern about animals just for their own sake, that they're alive and they have a right to be here just as I do. And even when I'm digging the worms in my compost, I'm concerned if I'm disturbing them now. So what about sentience? When we talk, first of all, could you define for people who don't know what sentience is? And it sounds like now you're finding studies that show that bugs have sentience.
Broadly speaking, sentience is the capacity to feel. So it requires that you're conscious, that you have some awareness of your existence and of the existence of the world around you. It includes the capacity to feel pain and to suffer and to feel pleasure and to experience joy. And so it can include a broad range of emotions and feelings. But if you have some kind of wakefulness, some kind of experience, awareness, you are sentient. And in response to the latter part of your question, yes, scientists are very curious and interested now about looking at sentience in groups of animals that would have just be assumed not to be sentient not very long ago. And now there is a growing discussion of the question of sentience in insects. One of the reasons this is developing probably is that we've had great discoveries about other invertebrates that clearly are sentient. I'm talking about the cephalopod mollusks, the octopuses and the squids and the nautiluses, and that group of marine animals. They've evolved a brain. Actually, it's a sort of a distributed brain through their body. They show emotions, they show cognition, they show play, problem solving. They hold grudges, all sorts of qualities that are uh, things that we wouldn't have thought that an invertebrate, an animal without the heralded backbone, would be capable of having. So we know now that consciousness and awareness and experience and sentience has evolved at least twice on the planet, because we have two vastly different groups of animals: vertebrates on the one hand and cephalopod mollusks on the other. And when you look at insects and how they behave and the complexity of their lives, and consider that being able to move away from a bad thing is very useful, or towards a useful, a good thing is very useful. Those are some of the hallmarks of where you might expect to see sentience evolved. And there has been some pretty rigorous science looking at consciousness and intelligence, cognition, and uh, and awareness, and also pain in insects and some of their relatives, the crustaceans, which are in the same phylum Arthropoda. It's therefore close relatives. And the evidence is, the jury's very much out, but the evidence is some pretty compelling evidence that these animals are not just alive; they have lives. They actually have experiences at some sort of level.
So when you were writing your What a Fish Knows book, I remember that you were collecting stories from people, anecdotes of their relationships with different fishes that they've had in their lives, in addition to the science-based studies that you outline. And I want to tell you a story about flies because as my awareness is growing, rather than seeing flies now as a nuisance in my home, I'm thinking, okay, if I was a fly, I wouldn't want to be in here. I'd want to be getting outside. And I'm thinking, well, that's why they're probably circling frantically. They're trying to figure out a way out. So I live in an apartment on the fourth floor. I have a balcony. So I've started to, in the summer, if they happen to get in, I wait until they calm down a bit. I try to get their attention, and then I swear I'm able to teach these guys how to get out the balcony door. And in addition, if two of them happen to come in, I notice that when I'm able to, it takes some time and patience, and sometimes hours pass. I let them settle, and then I try it again. I walk outside and I wave at them, and I'm sure my neighbors think I'm crazy, um, and so after the first one goes, then when the second one goes, I swear that first one shows up and was wait. Is this completely wackadoodle, or is this a possibility?
I like the word wackadoodle. I've not heard that. Um, it's a possibility. Learning has definitely been documented in insects. Um, Observational learning, which would be implying learning from another, is a little bit uncertain. And teaching or demonstrating, which you were suggesting for the fly who went out first, showing the way to others, that would be attributing more to insects than we generally think they're capable of doing. But time and again, when we look more closely at the lives of animals, we find that we've way underestimated them and that they're doing so much more than we thought they could do. So I've had other anecdotes like that where it looks like that at the very least these creatures are observing what others are doing, and they're sort of, it's almost like I see, so that's what I need to do. It's well documented in vertebrates, many vertebrates, learning and learning by observation, and it wouldn't surprise me if we start finding some examples in insects.
Well, we'll have to wait for your book and see what comes out about it. It's coming out later this year, is it?
Yeah, the date looks like around the 10th of November. I'm not delighted about that date because I think it's a day before Election Day in the United States, which
Oh,
is going to grab a lot of news. But maybe people will need a break from that at some point, and they'll say, "Oh, Superfly, that looks interesting."
that's a great
So
title.
the book is basically wrapped up. I mean, I've written it. I've just been going through my publisher's edits, and so it's an exciting stage. Also, stage where an author can feel impatient. It's like I have to wait another 6 months, but there's a lot of steps that have to be gone through to get a book from submission to actual publication.
And in this changing time, I think we're all learning that things might take a little bit longer as well as a result of that, I suppose.
Possibly,
So.
yeah. Fortunately, I've not heard any rumblings of that yet, so hopefully that
Oh,
won't
oh,
happen.
good. Okay, that's just the normal. All right. Well, we'll wait with anticipation. And then I'd just like to shift gears to talk, as we're talking about this idea of sentience and animals being able to know and understand and experience more than we give them credit for. And speaking of COVID, we're all anticipating a vaccine. Well, part of that vaccine process involves animal trials. And so, do you know about the animals that they're using to test the vaccine on? And can we talk about who those animals are?
Yeah, I haven't seen much discussion about that. I'm assuming that that there's animal experiments going on behind the scenes as we work towards a vaccine. And I've worked on the issue of the use of animals in research for many years in some of my past aspects, the other organizations that I work for that you mentioned in the introduction. And my focus was typically more on the quality of life, or the dearth of quality of life that the animals stuck in labs have, and how, quite aside from the experiments themselves, which are routinely harmful to the animals, the day-to-day life for a rat and a mouse in a lab is pretty impoverished, lacking stimulation, often lacking social company, which are so important to these creatures. No wonder they show neurotic behavior where they do repetitive functionless behaviors, so-called behavioral stereotypies, or neuroses, if you like, digging for literally hours against the plastic corner of the cage, or gnawing at the bars, doing repeated somersaults. It may look cute, and you may see that in YouTube videos, but in fact, it's an indication of an animal who is acutely stressed, or stressed over a long period, and becomes neurotically harmed. So there's that aspect of the whole animal research enterprise, and then there's the whole scientific validity aspect, the concern that how reliable is information we get from a rat or a mouse or even a cockroach or some other animal in a lab setting. how well does that predict how we will respond? And it's a very difficult comparison to make. There's all sorts of difficulties we run into and risks we run into. I favor, as does groups like Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, methods that are clinical, where we're actually looking at human patients and we're learning from them. There's computer modeling. There's all sorts of other approaches that appear to be much more dependable. I wanted to mention, I'm very pleased to learn of some new organizations coming out focusing specifically on this issue. I meant to look it up before we interviewed each other, but one of them is in Canada, in Windsor, Ontario. My friend Charu Chandrasekaran, I believe is how you pronounce her name, or close to it. She started an organization there that's getting funding, and its focus is on alternatives to the use of animals in testing and research. And another friend of mine, a medical doctor named Aisha Akhtar, who's in the Washington, D.C. area, I think her group is called the Center for Contemporary Sciences, or something similar. And I was talking to her recently, and she's literally just launched this organization. And these organizations will be focused on finding non-animal ways to not only replace animal methods, but to improve upon them vastly.
Mm-hmm. So, so again, I'm going to ask you, so presuming they're using mice or rats, why should we care about those creatures?
Back to that word we were discussing earlier, sentience. The fact is, these animals, quite aside from any question or doubts there may be with something like an insect, there's no doubt in the case of rodents and mammals, these animals are not just sentient, but they're acutely sentient. They have meaningful lives. They have wants, needs, desires, frustrations, excitement. They're social animals. I'm speaking now specifically of rats and mice, although these things apply to there's so many other species other than us, and so they are, to use the philosophical lingo, they are subjects of a life. They don't just have biology; they have biographies. They are individuals with meaningful lives, with lives that mean things to them. They have, when I say wants, needs, and desires, they want to forage. They want to go hunting for food, searching for their livelihood. They don't flourish when they're stuck in a little cage and there's food put in a bowl. You give them the choice of taking food readily available from a bowl or hiding it in their little cage, or what, excuse me, their living environment, so they have to search for it. They do what's called contra freeloading, which is a phenomenon whereby they ignore the food that's readily available, and they much rather go search for it. So that's just an illustration of the drive and desire they have to be active and to be engaged with their life. I think it's a really major ethical issue about keeping animals in captivity, and laboratories are particularly egregious for the captive circumstances that most of these animals find themselves in, because it's a, unlike say a zoo, which we can talk about, and there's other issues there, but laboratory environments, it's not about quality of life for the animals. Another irony there is, of course, if you're dealing with an animal who's neurotic because of prolonged captivity, how good a model of that is that of a human, a normal human, a healthy human. It makes them even more far removed from the human species.
And can you give us another example of two or two? I think I remember hearing you speak about relationships and mice knowing their family or something like that.
I don't remember what I may have said specifically about that, but suffice to say that these animals, their sensory systems on some ways, are more acute, more sensitive than ours. Their sense of smell, the fact that they can hear ultrasonic sounds, chemical awareness. So they are aware of other individuals in the milieu. Now, keep in mind, of course, the company of others isn't always welcome, depending on who it is in the setting. If it's an aggressive individual or somebody, two males who may be fighting for dominance, then one of the problems, another problem with captivity is if one of them wants to be the subordinate and says, okay, you win, I'll go away now. There's nowhere to go, so that sends the message to the aggressor that this individual is not leaving. They must still think that they want to fight it out, and the one who's trying to move away is frustrated from doing that, which is why people often think animals are more violent than they actually are. It's rare. It's relatively rare that animals engage in combats. Combat is dangerous for both parties. They would rather just come to an agreement and then just go separate ways. So captivity is problematic for that as well.
Yeah, and while you're on that subject, this idea that nature is combative, the whole kind of social Darwinist thing that only the strong survive, and that nature's always out fighting each other. There's these crazy nature shows where it's always about the predator and the prey,
Yes.
but in reality, there's a whole lot more going on. And you've written a lot about pleasure, animals seeking and finding and enjoying pleasurable activities.
Yeah, historically, the way we present animals, as you say, through nature documentaries, I got to say it's getting a bit better. But I tune into two nature channels here on my TV. Love Nature, one's called, and the one's BBC Earth. And there's still a lot of the conflict, a lot of the predator-prey stuff, partly because it's more sensational and it sells better to the public. But it's getting better. The way we present sharks, for instance, they're not the bloodthirsty killers that they've always been portrayed. There's a more nuanced, gradually more nuanced, although the music I find annoying, the soundtracks. So like the soundtrack's telling you what to think. It's like, just show me the footage, maybe a bit of narration, but I don't need to be guided by the soundtrack as to, oh, this is thumping, violent music. This must mean it's a scary predator prey thing. I can interpret that for myself. Thank you very much. So I definitely have some gripes with this stuff. But apropos to your question, absolutely. Nature is not nearly as red in tooth and claw, constant struggle for survival, a knife edge. Some of these tropes that you see rolled out in these documentaries, that time and again, they give you the impression that animals don't have a moment in their entire lives to stop and smell the roses. It's just simply not true. Animals do have leisure time. They need leisure time. They have meaningful social interactions. They play a lot, especially when they're young. uh, I just was reading a book by Carl Safina. It's just come out or just about to come out, and he made a very good point in there about a perspective. We need to realize that animals treasure their lives the way we do. They treasure their existence. It's intrinsically pleasurable. Even something like foraging, finding food, a vital function in life, and sometimes something that takes most of the day of many animals to find food. I'm looking at starlings nesting outside my window now, and they're not just feeding themselves, they're feeding their chicks. It must be in a very, very hectic, frenetic time in their lives. But keep in mind that the very act of doing something important and meaningful to you is rewarding. I mean, a lot of people, hopefully, they enjoy their careers. They love the weekends, but they also get a lot of satisfaction from the work they do. A lot of us do. So we all can experience the pleasure built into doing stuff that's meaningful to us, raising children, getting food. I mean, humans are a great illustration of that. We're such foodies. I mean, if we didn't eat it, we wouldn't survive. So it's absolutely vital to our existence, whether we like it or not. But look at the pleasure we build into that, and how we look forward to our next meal, especially when we're hungry. Well, other animals get hungry too, and other animals look forward to their food. And other animals are probably, when a bird is singing and to proclaim his or her territory, or looking for a mate, usually his. Um, it's an important function, but keep in mind the animal's experiencing that function and that behavior, and it's intrinsically rewarding for them. We need to be very open to that.
Hmm. And even as you wrote so eloquently about in What a Fish Knows, that a wonderful book. I love that book. And a lot of talk about the cooperative relationships among the fishes and mutually beneficial, and even examples of places where I forget the term, where it's not necessarily beneficial to the one party, but they do it anyways, sort of currying favor for future. Can you tell us some fish stories?
Sure, yeah, there's so much going on under the water that we didn't realize until relatively recently. I'll give you an example of a sort of a virtuous interaction that's being documented in a number of species, but certainly rabbit fishes. These are colorful, mostly yellow, white, and black fishes of various species that live on reefs, and they're algae eaters. And to get the algae, they need to stick their head down among the matrix of the reef and pluck away. And it's a vulnerable way to feed, because your attention is diverted, your head's down. You may not be able to see a predatory moray eel or a grouper or some other dangerous species coming your way who's hungry. Wouldn't it be nice to have a lookout, another one looking out for you, who can sound the alarm or signal to you that there's danger coming if it is? And that happens in these fishes. They're often seen foraging in pairs, and you got one head down feeding, and then there's another one swimming nearby with the head up who's playing lookout. That individual is foregoing the instant gratification of food in the interest of protecting the other one. Of course, I'm sure anyone can guess, they switch off after a couple of minutes, and the one who's been feeding comes up and the other one gets to go and eat. So both members of the party get to feed much more safely than if they were foraging alone. It's one example, and keep in mind we've only sort of scratched the surface of what fishes do. With over 33,000 species living in all sorts of habitats, including the deep ocean, the dark abyss. There's probably all sorts of other virtuous type behaviors going on. And then we have those predators I mentioned, groupers and moray eels. They're two of the largest predators on the reef, with the exception of sharks, probably. They have a remarkable association, at least in the Red Sea in some areas. And let me just make a point with that is cultures exist in fishes as well. Cultures being traditions that are not genetically inherited through genes. They're learned and passed on through observation and learning from generation to generation. And it could be that it's only in the Red Sea or maybe a few other places where the moray eels and the groupers have come to an agreement through time where they actually communicate with each other and cooperate, and they hunt collaboratively. Groupers, you can watch YouTube videos of this. The grouper does a little head shake in front of the moray eel, knows where that moray eel lives. They know each other. This is not willy-nilly. These are individuals with long-term relationships. And the grouper is inviting the moray to come and forage with them. And you can see them swimming across over the reef like a couple of incongruous Disney characters. And then the way it works is a little fish trying to escape them may swim into the reef. Well, the grouper can't go in there, but the moray eel, being slender like a ferret, can go in after them. If the moray eel catches that fish, the moray eel eats the entire fish. People have asked me, do they share the fish? No, it doesn't work that way. It's just that they both get more if they work together, because if the fish escapes out into the open, the grouper's waiting. So over time, it's estimated that they have up to 5 times greater success rate when they hunt collaboratively than if they hunt alone. A grouper will, another measure of the value of the relationship is that a grouper will point to a fish who swum into the reef. They only do this if there's a moray nearby. And they point by swimming head down in the water, and they'll stay there. The record observed is 23 minutes of doing that. Sometimes they'll swim over to the moray and try to bring the moray over. Clear intention, clear awareness, value of the relationship. So we've got referential gesturing, we've got signaling, we've got collaboration, things that until recently we just didn't think fishes were capable of. And those are just some examples. There's many others.
Hmm. Lots more going on there than we've known, certainly.
And if you want to talk about cleaner client relationships, we can always talk about that too. You kind of intimated that in your question. That's another huge mutualism among fish. Where, shall I describe that briefly?
Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning. It's one of the grandest mutualisms in nature, one of the best studied, and it's typically on reefs. And you have so-called cleaner fish. There's various species. The blue striped cleaner wrasse is probably the most famous. And they set up stations on the reef. They're there every day. It's the same location. So these so-called client fish of more than 100 known species, they know where their particular cleaners are. Again, it's a long-term relationship built on trust and service. And they swim in there, wait their turn sometimes if there's a queue. And then when it's their turn, they swim in and they hover while these cleaners pluck over their bodies, removing parasites and algae and what have you that's undesirable. The cleaners will, the clients will open their mouths to allow the cleaners to swim inside and pluck food or parasites off their teeth or off of other parts of their mouths, in and out of the gills. Similarly, there's a cooperative arrangement. The clients don't, a lot of them are larger predators, but they never eat the cleaner wrasses. At least it's never been observed. It's just not a good way to sustain good long-term business relations if you eat your business partner. But it does get a bit Machiavellian. Sometimes the cleaners don't do as good a job. They may be a little bit shoddy. They may even mucus nip, which is when they remove a little moat of that slimy protective layer on the client. It's nutritious and it plays an important role in their lives. They don't like to lose it. They will jolt. They will do a body jolt, which may be because it hurts, or it may be to signal to other clients in the queue these guys aren't doing a great job today. You might want to go somewhere else. The cleaners, for their part, want to maintain good reputation. They want to keep their eBay ratings up with all the clients in the queue. And so that gets to the mollifying behavior. It's probably why sometimes cleaners will take a break from removing parasites and will then flutter their pectoral fins against the body of the client. It's a massage. It's a little extra reward for coming to us and getting our service. So as you can see, it's complex. There's probably over 150 published scientific articles based on close observation and study of this relationship. It's very well studied, and new aspects to these phenomena are coming to light all the time.
Hmm. I think I remember you saying that sometimes the behavior of the cleaner fish will shift depending on how many clients are in the queue, if they think they can get away with stuff because there's nobody watching.
Yeah, it seems kind of likely that that's the case. If you find a pattern, and this pattern has been documented, that less if there are more fishes, more client fishes in the queue who are probably observing the goings on, then the cleaners tend to do a better job. If there are fewer, they're more likely to do a shoddy job. So it implies, I mean, there could be another explanation there, but it implies that the cleaners are aware of who's watching them. Keep in mind that these animals, small fish though they are, these cleaners, they need to be smart. They need to have certain types of intelligence, one of which is a good memory, because it behooves them, a cleaner fish, to know how long it's been since this particular individual client fish last visited. If it was an hour ago, they probably don't have many new parasites. They're probably not worth spending a lot of time inspecting. If it's been 3 days or more, in some water habitats in the ocean, parasite loads build up very fast. It's a very active community, the parasites there, little sea lice and mites or whatever they may be called. And so the cleaner will probably know that they should probably spend more time. It'll be fruitful to spend more time with this client because it's been a while. So perhaps that may explain why scientists, when they tested cleaner fish on a sort of a basic or simple sounding kind of memory or time tracking experiment, where they presented them with two kinds of foods, one on a blue plate, one on a red plate. Blue plate food would be left for a while. The red plate food would be taken away after 2 minutes. The prediction would be, if the animal's aware of things, that soon they would learn to eat the food from the red plate first and then eat the blue plate food later, because it's going to stay regardless, whereas the red plate is ephemeral. It's going to go away. They learned that. It took many trials, maybe 40 trials or so, 45, I think. However, chimpanzees, orangutans, capuchin monkeys, all very big-brained primates, when on a different, somewhat setting, because it's on land, presented with a comparable task, they couldn't learn it in 100 trials. Even the 4-year-old daughter of one of the scientists designing the experiment failed the test. So it was an example where little tiny little fish, probably by dint of the lifestyle that they have, their particular employment, their job, scores better than mammals who are heralded for being particularly intelligent. So animals tend to be good at what's meaningful and important to them. If there's a benefit to having spatial intelligence, or a benefit to having a memory of who was last here and recognizing individuals, chances are the animal's going to have it. And these things have been shown in certain fish species.
Hmm. So, doing animal research, I think it's obvious that we're going to learn more about meaningful stuff about animals if we observe them in their natural habitat. But a lot of zoos and aquariums claim that this is a good place to learn about animals. You mentioned earlier that you'd be willing to talk about zoos. Would, now we're seeing things where animals are completely devoid of any contact with humans, and which is even more difficult for them, I think, in some cases in zoos and aquariums. And so, what do you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit that it's been a while since I've been to zoos. I haven't spent a lot of time at zoos, partly because I have some misgivings about the quality of life for a lot of animals in zoos. I say a lot of animals intentionally because I think some animals, particularly animals with very small home ranges in nature who don't need a huge area to go to, um, perhaps can lead a decent quality of life in a zoo setting. But I think animals like large predators, elephants, animals who have big home ranges, this would apply to most animals because we simply cannot provide the kind of setting in captivity that they would need. And I can't count the times when I've seen this behavioral stereotypy, again, this neurotic repetitive behavior, pacing back and forth, back to the other corner, back again. The large predators, often there's a well-worn path next to the cage barrier where they've gone back and forth thousands of times. It's disturbing, and I think to be progressive, we really need to do away with keeping animals like that in captivity. Um, I have very mixed feelings about zoos in that regard. I've also feel like most of the zoos that I've gone to, including some of the most reputable ones that do a relatively good job compared to others, um, there was a real dearth of educational material. It's just a short plaque, if anything, and there's not much to learn. Some of the better zoos do have special events or where people can interact with the orangutans and what have you. The National Zoo in Washington D.C., where I used to live, they have these brilliant orangutan uh, cables that run over the zoo. The orangutans can leave their enclosure and, like as if they're climbing through the trees with these big ropes, or I don't know if it's metal or plant based, but they can climb around. Of course, they can't come down. I think there's an electric barrier that keeps them up there, but it gives them some freedom. So with innovation, we can make it less bad. But I think most of the animals in zoos, really, it's not an ideal existence. Okay, fair enough. I grant you, living in the wild, maybe the word ideal is hardly the right word to apply, but there is that huge benefit of being free and having freedom. Sure, there are hazards to life wherever you live, including in the wild, maybe especially in the wild. And some people, I think it's a bit of a specious argument, though, to say that, look, they're so safe. They got no predation. Hey, I'd be much safer if I stayed in my house all the time and didn't venture outside, especially particularly telling in a time of a pandemic. Indeed, we're being told to stay at home. People find it a privation. Why? Because we do like to go outside. We do like to go and do things in the fresh air and go shopping. And, we all value our freedom, and we need to be fully aware that that applies to other species as well.
Hmm. And especially because I think a lot of these animals that end up in zoos are plucked from the wild, as compared to sanctuaries, which are where animals are rescued to who are injured or escaping the slaughterhouse or that sort of thing. Are zoos, do you think, is there any way we can, I'd love to live in a world where aquariums and zoos, they're not just going to disappear, but maybe if we could just make them places more like sanctuaries. Like you've worked on a sanctuary. Can you tell us what's different between a sanctuary and a zoo environment?
Well, back to your first comment, I'm not sure to what extent animals in zoos these days are plucked from the wild. I think most of the animals are exchanged and coming from other locations, which has issues in itself. Animals do make friends, and it's very hard for them to be taken away from somebody they know, especially if you're talking about bigger primates and gorillas. And it happens all the time, and the animals have no say in that. Did you
So
have
so
something you want to mention?
yeah, so I'm just curious then. So what's happening is that they're being bred in the zoos and then they're traded and sold, I guess.
I believe that's the great the majority of animals that are in zoos and moved among zoos are not acquired from the wild anymore. I'm sure I would think there are exceptions to that, but most of them are bred and exchanged, which, as I say, raises some other ethical issues. You mentioned sanctuaries. I've visited a number over the years, and I used to volunteer regularly at Poplar Spring Animal Sanctuary, which is in rural Maryland near Washington, D.C. Beautiful sanctuary, very well run. These are facilities for rescued and rehabilitated, or sometimes they need to be rehabilitated animals, often from neglectful cruelty cases, rescued, or just various situations, various backgrounds: goats, sheep, pigs, cows, chickens, turkeys, rabbits, various species. And most of these, as that list indicates, are species that are bred in huge numbers to be slaughtered at a young age and eaten by humans. So often, especially when they're coming from that context, they're coming from abusive or difficult lives beforehand. and then they come to this oasis. We can only speculate on what it's like internally for them, but they're usually afraid at first because life has been very difficult for them, and why would this be any different? But to see an animal who's never really felt the grass under their feet, figuratively or literally, suddenly have that, and to be around friendly people who are doing kind things to them, it's very uplifting as a human to witness this and see how they come out of their shells. Usually, I mean, many of them have neuroses that they don't get rid of completely through life, but they're very resilient, these animals, and they typically have a very high quality life, and it's really nice to witness that and contribute to it.
Mm. So, on that note, I'd just like to mention that this weekend on Sunday, May 24th, there's an event called Letting Out the Cows at the Farmhouse Garden Animal Home, where I guess it's a sanctuary. It used to be they raise the cows for either dairy or meat or both, I guess. And but they switched to become a sanctuary. And so people can go online and watch. I guess they move them from their winter pasture into the green pastures, which apparently they're like puppy dogs. They run and jump and enjoy their lives. Is that near you? I think it's Uxbridge in Ontario.
I hadn't heard of that in Uxbridge, but I know it happens around the world, including in not just sanctuary settings, but farm settings. A lot of cattle do get to go out, fortunately. And I've watched any number of terrific videos of this on YouTube, of some herd in Germany or England, or various locations, or the United States, when they've been cooped up indoors for much, if not all, of a long, hard winter. And here's the day around this time of year when they're let out to the pasture for the first time. And you cannot watch the behavior of these animals, these big cows with their swinging udders and their massive size. You cannot look at them the way they behave without concluding that these animals are literally experiencing joy. It's just absolute joy to see them, and you can see the joy in them. They're literally kicking their legs, jumping, spinning, as you say, bucking around. And I'm a little worried looking at them. It's like they're so massive, it's like they're going to break a leg, but they can't contain themselves, and it's really terrific to see. Highly recommended viewing if you can look for some of these YouTube videos of cows let out to pasture in the spring.
Right. Okay. So now I'm thinking, comparing again zoos to sanctuaries. So sanctuaries are places, it's not perfect, but they do their best, I understand, to create an environment that's as natural as possible for the animals, and allowing them. They're not breeding environments, and so they're allowing the animals then to just live out their lives and then die a natural death. And whereas, so now if the zoos then are doing this breeding process, and then swapping animals or selling them amongst each other, and then claiming, like, how, I'm not sure you could claim that this animal, that we're learning anything about a natural animal activity if an animal has been bred into an environment. It seems to me they would lose some of their instincts.
Well, yeah, the more artificial an environment, a living environment, the more you're removing the animal from its natural setting, the more likely that you're not going to see normal behavior. Zoos would be kind of somewhere in the middle. Sanctuaries, and we're just assuming these are good sanctuaries, and most of the ones that I've been to, the true sanctuaries, are good. um, the more they tend to provide a bigger space for the animals, a more naturalistic space than, say, in a zoo, which in turn provides more opportunities for a natural existence than, say, a lab. Labs would be sort of at the very low end, or a factory farm, heaven forbid, probably the worst of all, on average. So yeah, the more confinement, the more you remove the animal from its natural setting, the less it has the opportunity to even express basic behaviors that they would do in the wild. The animals all have repertoires. We ethologists call it an ethogram. It's a listing of all the behaviors, and depending on how detailed you go into, you're going to talk about not dozens but hundreds of different behaviors, and many of those won't be expressed in settings of extreme confinement over a long time, because the animal just, there's no opportunity to actually do the things that the animals would normally do.
Mm. All right. Well, oh, I know. Before I leave you, one thing I was wondering about was when you met Jane Goodall. I noticed on your Facebook that there's a picture of you with Jane Goodall. I imagine that was a big event for you.
Yeah, I've had the good fortune of meeting her three times during my career. Once was at a book signing about 30 years ago in Washington, D.C. The one that I posted recently on Facebook was at a conference in Brussels. I was a speaker and she was a speaker. As usual, she's sort of ushered in, does her thing, and then has to leave because she has some other event. But I did get to actually interact with her and we had took a few photos and that was nice. Yeah, I mean, I'm like so many biologists or non-biologists of our era in my age group. I grew up reading her books in high school and just becoming enamored with what she did, seeing some of the nature documentaries on TV about her and her life. And, she's just a super inspiration. She's done so much to change the way we look at animals and to change the way that science does animal studies. When she started out in the early 60s, you did not name the animals you studied. That was just taboo, and she took all kinds of flack on that. And now it's like the idea of numbering animals and keeping them, not thinking them as individuals, is ludicrous. So she's done a great deal to turn that around and help to revolutionize the way science does its business now than compared to what it used to do.
She's a hero for sure. And you mentioned being a kid and being, enthralled with animals and insects. I've been working in the school system until, of course, recently. And at playtime, there was one school that had snakes, and then there's other schools that have various bugs. And kids would come running up to me and show me quite proudly that they'd captured this lizard or whatever creature. And my reaction was, let it go. We can't. It's a creature and it needs to live on its own terms, and it doesn't necessarily want to be in your little hands. And it's really nice that you want to play with it, but maybe it doesn't want to play with you. Like maybe we've taken it now far away from its friends. And the resistance, honestly, that I got from these kids, and I probably would have reacted in the same way. Like, no, this is mine. This is my little creature now. I found it, and I'm taking care of it. They would tell me, oh no, I'm taking really good care of it. And so it was really interesting to try to realize that this difference, again, once you get into the vegan headspace and realize that we respect the animals and their own environment and how they want to live rather than how they serve us. So I'm wondering, what would you say to kids maybe now who are growing up in this other world where we're spending more time in our backyards and maybe we're having a closer look at bugs and insects, and this is how then going back to your research that you're doing now, like what should we be considering when we're out in the world and we're seeing bugs? Should we just be swatting at the flies? How can we interact with them differently, and how can we create a better world for all of them as well?
Well, your anecdote speaks to the responsibility the grown-ups have in inculcating certain types of values towards animals at an early age. It's terrific. The kids are excited and interested, and they catch the toad or the lizard or whatever, and want you to see. And I totally know how you feel. My first worry, my first concern is for that little animal. It's like I want them to go free. But at the same time, it's terrific that the kids are enthused and interested, because if we're not interested, we're not going to become engaged and want to help and want to protect them. And those kids are tomorrow's leaders. So it's so important that we get kids out in nature, that we do expose them, that they do touch where it's appropriate and very briefly before letting them go. And that letting them go is, as you know, such a crucial part of the message, because it tacitly, or you can be explicit about it, but at the very least it tacitly shows that it teaches the kid that the animal has intrinsic value, that the animal has its own interests, and those interests may not align with yours. Your interest may be to keep the animal as some treasured thing. Well, the animal just is not going to thrive in your bedroom. And so, there's various ways of teaching that, but by example is probably the best way. So we can't have enough Janine Bancrofts out there showing kids the value of letting them go back in the wild. You're needed in that setting.
Oh, well, that's very nice, Jonathan, and thank you. And you're a pretty awesome guy yourself. So, on a final note, then you're back to your research, and what can we do? What else can we do for insects? You mentioned that pesticide use is having an impact. As gardeners, what should we do to create a habitat as best we can for them?
Yeah, I mean, some of these situations present dilemmas. I don't begrudge, or I don't. It's understandable for gardeners, or especially if they're growing food, to try and protect their food. But to the extent that we can do it in a way that's more naturalistic and more eco-friendly, that would mean not using poisons and pesticides, trying to use mechanical devices. But inevitably, there will be challenges with that. Or the organic revolution and movement is a positive step. But it's just as an anecdote. I'm living in a shared situation, a building with about 8 condo units, and I just learned the other day that there is to use the wording in the letter, a required spider spraying that's about to happen on
Yikes.
June 8th. And I read that and I thought, what? First of all, I don't know quite what they mean by required. I don't believe there's any state or provincial law requiring it. Um, so, I'm very, very dismayed to learn that. And it just makes me look out at all the other properties around here and how many of those have their spider spraying. And so I'm currently mulling over what action I'm going to take to try and prevent this from happening. Apparently, I have to get a majority vote among the residents to stop it. And so we'll see how that comes out. But we have to stop being at war with nature and wildlife. Back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, the loss of insect life. The last thing we should be doing is spraying against spiders. For one thing, spiders themselves are crucial elements of the ecology, and they're not harmful creatures. But the other thing is that when you spray, it's non-selective. It's going to kill all sorts of other animals too. They told me, somebody I was talking to was saying, well, we don't even need this. We don't even notice. The spiders seem to be back to normal within a couple of weeks, which of course begs the question, well, why spray in the first place? But anyway, it's just old habits and this kind of combative approach to nature and insects in particular. Time is ripe to get rid of that approach and to be much more eco-friendly and more responsible. Back to what we said at the beginning, it's only going to come around and bite us in the butt if we don't. Insects will be around long after humans are gone.
All right. So the book is Superfly, and you're on various social media. Where are good places to find you, Jonathan?
I'm really the only social media I'm really regularly active is on Facebook. So I have an author page and I have a home page, and I try to post there at least a couple of times a week, if not more. I do a newsletter about approximately once a month called All Things Fish. I'm thinking of changing it to All Things Fish and Fly, but beginning to introduce some insect stuff in there as well. But it's a sort of a smorgasbord of news items and things that are going on in my book work, and try every once in a while a quiz, the winner of which gets a copy of my book and that sort of thing. So it's a fun place to come once a month.
Your book is wonderful, and What a Fish Knows. I'm looking forward to Superfly. And there are used copies of What a Fish Knows around. So we do have a wonderful used bookstore in Victoria, and other people, if you go check it out at your local bookstore. And then you usually, I know with What a Fish Knows, you did a tour, a speaking tour. I guess you're not probably. Do you think you might be able to do that with Superfly, or do you have plans
It's
for?
too early to see how things will play out. Once the book gets to a pre-publication galley phase where they send out copies to media outlets and start to put the word out, that's not going to happen yet. But yeah, I probably did. I've probably done over 80 or 100 talks on fishes in the last 4 years, and I've done well over 100 media interviews. So who knows how the response to Superfly will be? It's a different subject, the same sort of treatment, but a different group of animals. So I'm hopeful that there'll be quite a lot of interest in it. But chances are I'll be doing quite a lot of speaking and media interviews about them in starting later this year.
All right. Well, the growing vegan world will continue to support you, Jonathan. Thanks for all that you're doing to contribute to us. And good luck with everything over there in Ontario.
Thanks, Janine. Nice to talk with you.